On the 21st of November 1916, His Majesty's hospital ship the Britannic sank in the Aegean Sea following a collision with a mine. While this wasn't considered a war crime, the White Star Line vessel became an innocent victim of a great war. The Britannic's story was a tragic but unknown one, and over a century later, some parts aren't known or have been told. In this documentary, we will be diving deeper into the untold story of the HMHS Britannic, in the words of the people who were there. On the 21st of October 1916, while sailing in the Kea Channel, a German submarine called U-73 began laying down mines around 250 feet below the water surface. Under the command of Captain Gustav Sees, it is estimated that U-73 had planted the mines because Sees noticed ships prefer to pass through the channel. Sees ordered to lay 2 mine barriers, each with 6 Mark VI moored mines, a little further to the southwest of the channel. There was no information about the mines and nobody was aware of the situation, but it is thought, according to a French intelligence report that was published in January of 1917, that a second used submarine, U-72, had been active around the Kea Channel in November, and both the U-72 and U-73 submarines had altogether planted 15 mines. There was even a report that U-73 had laid mines in the Kea Channel in the early morning of the 21st of November. Around that time frame, the mines had destroyed a variety of ships, including the SS Bertigala, which sank on the 14th of November 1916, and the HMHS Braemar Castle, which survived the explosion on the 23rd but was pulled from military service, traveling to La Spezia to be repaired. However, ships like the HMHS Britannic, which only entered the Kea Channel, were at risk, and the crew on board couldn't imagine what would happen to them. After the sun rose above the Aegean Sea on the 21st of November 1916, the HMHS Britannic was nearing her destination as she was an hour away from reaching the Gulf of Athens. Life on board had continued as normal. Nurses like Sheila Macbeth, Ada Garland, and Violet Jessup would wake up and get ready for the day. However, some nurses had to work long or night shifts, which affected their sleeping patterns.
Life on board the Britannic before she sank was just a normal, everyday. Everyone got up for breakfast. Although Ada Garland, she said that she must have overslept because the day before they was making like 500 beds and she was very tired and I think she was up reading a book or something and she overslept and she managed to arrive at the dining room, on Britannic, very late.
Meanwhile, able seaman Archie Jewell would have been busy with his responsibilities. There is no information on his whereabouts before 8 a.m., but it is possible that he was carrying out deck operations in the boiler rooms or the tunnels near the firemen's quarters. As the 8 o'clock watch was approaching and the watertight doors were temporarily opened, 15-year-old Boy Scout George Pearman was performing his duties on board the Britannic, which included operating one of the ship's lifts. He was a member of the 2nd Southampton or Shirley Scouts or the 2nd Fremantle Troop, and he and his fellow scouts were chosen to join the Britannic's crew for her 6th voyage at the request of Captain Charles Bartlett. The Boy Scouts, numbering 16 or 17, came from Liverpool and Southampton and took on roles as signalers, officers, captain servants, and lift boys. Their ages ranged from 12 to 16 years old, with George likely being one of the oldest boys on board. George was kept busy, especially when operating lifts, as he would transport many of the medical staff to the ship's upper decks. Captain Charles Bartlett was preparing for a bath when, at 8 a.m., he, George, Archie, Ada, and Violet heard an unfamiliar sound that vibrated the Britannic. The ship struck the mine that U-73 had planted in the Kea Channel. The explosion had struck the Britannic's starboard side underneath the bridge area. Instantly, many of the medical staff and crew members would react to this unusual vibration. Archie Jewell was the first to notice the signs of danger, as he mentions in his testimony about noticing a smell of powder. Suddenly, he would see the water pouring in, and in a fraction of a second, his head was cut open by a man rushing out of a cabin door where the Britannic was struck.
I heard the explosion and I detected the smell of powder. Soon after, I saw the water pouring in. My head was cut open by a man rushing out of a cabin door, right where she was struck. I ran up to the boat deck and then someone tied my eye up, so I was like old Nelson, only one eye.
After noticing the explosion, Captain Bartlett rushed to the bridge and gave orders to close the watertight doors and send a distress signal. However, upon impact with the mine, two of the watertight doors were jammed, and the Marconi telegraph aerial collapsed onto the ship's forward well deck. The explosion from the mine caused a gas bubble that lifted the Britannic's bow and twisted her hull. 6 out of her 16 watertight compartments were flooded, and water had entered the open portholes on the ship's starboard side.
But yeah, everything seemed normal. But earlier on, the doctors had ordered the nurses to open the porthole on the lower decks to ventilate the wards. Again, this wasn't the done thing, because even with Britannic being a hospital ship and protected under the Geneva Convention law, even a hospital ship would be at risk of being attacked, and they were left open because it was the only way you could ventilate the wards. You've got to imagine the Aegean Sea. It's Greece. It's still warm, and this was before aircon and AC sort of thing. It was the only way you could get cool air through the wards, and because on many of the voyages, the nurses would often complain or they did complain about how stuffy the wards could be, especially on the lower decks. So you can imagine that to make it more comfortable, these soldiers that would take patients at Lemnos was a way to make them comfortable.
And despite this, the Britannic didn't stop, as Captain Bartlett decided that the best course of action was to turn towards Kea in an attempt to beach her in her shallows.
Bartlett thought the ship would be safe. If we'd struck a mine or been torpedoed, maybe the ship would be safe, because the Britannic was designed to stay afloat with 6 compartments flooded. So they thought, okay, we'll make it. We'll be fine. Obviously, as we know, that wouldn't be the case. There was no immediate panic after the mine detonation. There was nothing untoward, really. I know one of the stewards came in telling everyone he'd rushed into the dining room, told all the nurses to get the life jacket. But obviously, everything on the bridge was at some sort of immediate panic, sort of not panic, but okay, what do we do? Okay, we need to know where we are. We're not far from Kea Island, so we need to get our ship towards Kea. That's what Bartlett, and he came rushing in onto the bridge, still dressed in his pajamas. He never got dressed into his captain's suit. The only way he could save the ship was to beach the vessel to try and reach them shallow. But unfortunately, Wine seemed to have done not just the damage to the ship, but damage to other things as well. They tried to steer the ship, but they couldn't do it. The rudder wouldn't respond. Okay, so what do we do? Okay, we need to get this ship to Kea. But the other thing they found that was a problem: telegraphs, the cables had somehow been damaged in the explosion. So the only way they could get signal to the engine room was through the emergency telegraph. Also, what happened is, because the ship had been flexed, it had been lifted out of the water just a little bit due to the explosion, the bubble from the explosion. It as the ship came down, it kind of flexed itself, and somehow the cables from what went from mast to mast had flexed too much and had snapped. which means that they'd lost connection to the silent room. So Captain Bartlett had ordered for distress call to be sent out to all ships. Problem is, they could send out a distress call, they couldn't receive a reply back. So, okay, it was good that they could still send a signal out.
In the dining saloon, Ada Garland had just begun eating her breakfast when she heard a distressing sound. She would later describe the scene in her memoir.
I had just sat down and started on some stewed pears when I heard a loud report, an indescribable noise. It appeared we had come into a collision or something. Everyone jumped. Trays dropped from stewards, shaking hands, and there was a clutter of broken glass. But everyone soon came to their senses and were told to sit down. Everything was all right. We had only run into a barge. Ladies, you must get to your cabins and fit your lifebelts, then hurry onto the boat deck.
At first, Ada thought the ship wasn't sinking. However, as she walked to her cabin to retrieve her lifebelt, she had a premonition.
I distinctly remember as I quietly walked the beautiful marble staircase and along the long corridor where the sun streamed in the portholes, lighting up all our lovely cabins. This was goodbye to everything.
Ada collected her lifebelt, coat and rug, and in haste, she went along the corridors to the wards to see if there were patients who needed her assistance. However, unlike her calm nature, Ada describes the panic from her patients, nurses, and even the matron was crying out her instructions.
It was a terrible sight. Men who could barely walk, struggling to climb the stairs. The screams and shouts could be heard all over the ship as the badly injured were being moved. We all helped until the very last minute when we heard the cry of our dear brave matron saying, "Hurry up, my children."
Violet Jessup was on her way to attend to a sick sister with her breakfast when she felt the Britannic shiver, causing the crockery on the dining tables to shake and break.
I was upstairs in the pantry getting this nurse her breakfast, and all the staff, medical staff, dozens of doctors, you see, and nurses, they were all in the saloon at breakfast.
Right.
When suddenly, crash.
Right.
Well, no sooner did the crash happen than everybody stood up from their table and disappeared. And it was so different to the Titanic, where there didn't seem to be any panicky movement, you know. No.
Everything happened as though normally.
Yes, yes.
Right. But of course this was wartime.
Exactly, yes. And so all I did was then, I was still intent taking this nurse on breakfast, was to collect my pat about her and my piece of toast and a roll and make a pot of tea as quick as because the pantry was empty by then and I was just left alone and go down to her. And by that time, you see, two sisters occupied each cabin had two. The sick one was still in bed, looking very white and frightened, and the other one was getting her things. And I said, "It's all right. I'll look after Sister so and so." And I said, "No, you must get up, and I'll dress you." And I could see she was trembling. She wouldn't be any good at all. So I decided to let her keep her pajamas on, you see. And I said, "I'm going to put your uniform over your pajamas because you may have to climb down a ladder and it'll be better for you." And it took me so long, and I made her take some of this tea and a bit of roll and that while I was dressing her. And finally, I said to this other, "Don't worry, I'll take her up the stairs when I've got her dressed." And when I took her up the stairs, the young officer who was at the sort of door, you know, he nearly went white because he said, "All the nurses have gone." So I said, "Well, I've had to dress this nurse," and she was quite useless. She couldn't do a thing. So he said, "Well, I'll take her along because they're all, more or less, the boat's ready to be lowered."
Meanwhile, Sheila Macbeth was in the dining saloon, having 2 spoonfuls of porridge, when she noticed the vibration, which sent a shiver down her spine. In an interview recorded by her grandson in 1994, Sheila described what happened when she reacted to the sudden shudder.
The day we were hit, we were at breakfast, and it was 8 minutes past 8 in the morning, and we were sitting in this huge dining room, and there was this sudden bang as the ship shook, and we all sort of stood up with the shock of it, and somebody shouted, "Sit down until the sirens go." And when they went, we went to our cabins to get our lifebelt, coat, and a blanket that we were told to take.
At the same time, Boy Scout George Pearman was already operating one of the lifts when he felt the explosion. He immediately went up on deck, where he was handed a spare lifebelt by a passing crew member, as his lifebelt was still in his quarters, which was destroyed due to the impact. Captain Bartlett, while attempting to beach the Britannic, ordered the lifeboats to be readied as the ship began to lift starboard, with some portholes already beneath the waterline, and the left propeller blade was still turning. However, steam was vented from the first funnel to relieve boiler pressure.
So you've got to imagine Captain Bartlett's now trying to beach the ship. Problem is the bow's no longer facing the horizon. She's going down. The bow is facing downwards. It's only going to go in the direction you point it at. So with him moving the ship, but bearing in mind he wasn't, unlike Captain Smith on board Titanic, he didn't have the luxury of having a ship designer. He didn't have the luxury of having Thomas Andrews there. He wasn't a ship designer. He was only getting reports back from his crew that had gone down to see to inspect the damage, to see the flooding. So he was only getting more of a, I wouldn't say even an overview, just a few messages coming back and forth, because he didn't know the true extent of the damage. So he was moving a ship, which may have caused more problems, because interesting to think that about halfway through the sinking, Captain Bartlett noticed the flooding was accelerating, and also the sinking was accelerating. So what he did, he stopped his ship, and the interesting thing is, he stopped his ship and gave the order to abandon the vessel. So he gave the order for the lifeboats to be launched. He noticed that the ship was starting, the settling of the ship seemed to slow, the flooding seemed to have slowed, which is interesting to think that maybe his ship, right from the point that she exploded, from the explosion, she might have lasted a bit longer, or, who knows, but it's just interesting to take that into a fact. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to Captain Bartlett, some lifeboats had been launched without his command, and 2 lifeboats, one containing Violet Jessup, lifeboat number 4, on the port side, and she said that the boat was lowered, and then the boat was lowered away.
And he said, "What about you?" So I said, "Oh, I've got, all sailors have a boat, you see,
Right.
according to the boat of trade."
Right.
So I said, "I'm number 4, I'll go along to my boat, I've got to go back to my cabin yet." So I went along and collected my engagement ring and my clock and different things, and went up.
Excuse me, may I interrupt? At this time, was the boat listing at all?
No.
Was the ship listing, or there was no evidence that she was sinking?
No.
Yeah.
Oh, well, there was a little, because when you looked out forward, you could see she was a little bit down.
Down at the head.
But no, she was such a big ship too, you see.
Yeah.
They don't, it's extraordinary, but neither of the ships that I've been sinking on
Yeah.
have...
And very few people can say that, by the way.
specialising in sinking.
Yeah.
Have ever behaved badly,
Yeah.
they've all been,
Yeah.
gone down as ladies.
So you came up from your cabin with your rosary and your
Yes,
other
my bits
belongings.
all my bits and pieces.
Right.
And you know, the thing was that I was so keen on not using any sense at all, putting a couple of rolls in one pocket, and my prayer book in the next, and then turning my apron up so that nothing would drop out of my pockets. Going up, find a number 4 boat, and it was just about to be lowered, and there was a poor little frightened bellboy there that I tried to cheer up and tell him it was all right, it always ended all right, sort of thing, you know. And they, you know, it's awful on leaving new boats because if ever you're on a boat that has to be lowered, it's awful because when they're lowering boats, the ropes are all new. Terrible, because one end of the boat will go down and the other end set up, you know. We left the little bellboy halfway up the ship, you see. He got so panicky that he took the wrong rope, and it was a rope that was hanging over the side. And
you stayed on the side?
No, we got him to drop. We insisted that, let's go and fall into the boat, we'll catch you, sort of thing. But we got down, and next to me was standing a doctor. This is the Britannic.
Yeah.
And he was a very quiet chap, but I happened to have my back to the ship, you know, looking at it. And it was very crowded. And as we touched water, everybody's unsafe.
Out of the boat?
Out of the boat, making a wonderful dive, just like to see fish, you know, the colour. And standing next to us, I said, why are they doing that? You know, I still had my back to the boat. And he didn't answer. And I looked at him, I thought, well, what's the matter with you, sort of thing? I still had my senses, you know. And I'm sitting there to look at the boat, and of course, she was still going on, and she had 3 propellers, and they were cutting everybody to pieces. You see?
I see. She was already tipping out. The propellers were out of the water?
No, she was on an even keel. Right. She wasn't even...
I see.
She was, that's the thing, she wasn't even...
the largest ship in the world at that time. And let us hear now what happened.
Well, I was left alone, you see, and I decided, which would it be better to be, cut the pieces or drown? I mean, I had to make the decision. If I stayed in the boat, she was being drawn, you see, then. It's wonderful how, even at a distance, that those 3 propellers could draw.
Right.
And I could feel her going over, and I thought, well, now,
which is it?
Drowning is not as bad as being cut to pieces. And doing it cold-bloodedly, too.
So you went over the side? I
went over the side.
Did you have a life jacket on?
I did something, John, that I always... If your mother... Well, I don't suppose I took up a boat drill, but I was always very, very strict, you know.
Strict with your passengers?
Oh, terribly.
Yeah.
Now, don't put on a life vest unless you know that you mustn't put it on over clothes. I mean, jackets and that. Right. Put it on as near to your body as possible. Right. And they used to say, you're awfully strict on boat.
You had good reason to be.
Well, anyway, on this trip, I was hoping to see my brother, and for that reason I took all my best clothes. Although it was only your brother, you always like to be very smart. And I had this lovely coat. Well, instead of putting the coat over the lifebelt, I put the lifebelt over the coat. A thing I never allowed a passenger. I could kill the passenger if they did that. And so when I went into the water, I went down miles with the weight of, clothes, and came up under the boat. And to begin with, I got a terrible blow on the head, which you may think is the reason for me behaving as I am today, and it's going to give me some food and talking too much. But I got a terrific bang on the head. And, it did occur to me, if I get another like that, I'll be finished. Not panicking, it's just thought.
Registered in your mind.
You keep. I won't let go, so I let go. I let out my laughter, he was telling the story, like, he panicked because he could feel this strong hand, and then I opened my hand and let go.
Yeah.
And he was a little red-haired, what do you call it, orderly.
Yeah.
In the orderly corps, because the
Medical order.
medical
Yeah.
orderly, you see. And he was telling his mate when I heard him say, and he said, a strong grip, and he said, then suddenly let go, and I said, that was me. And he looked at me, because he'd heard I'd been, the water. And I thought to myself, what a grand thing that I let go, because he's a lovely little chap.
Yeah.
But what a terrible thing, I'd been killed and dragged in.
Dragged him with you. But you came up all right after you let
Yes,
go.
I came up all right, and sort of floated. But the only thing, of course, that nearly absolutely killed me was the first thing that was quite near me when I turned round was an open human head.
Yeah.
Just.
Somebody hit the propeller, probably.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, and the thing that, of course, it would come to your mind. It reminded me when my father used to kill a sheep, and a sheep's head.
Yeah.
I never saw anything so dreadful.
Yeah.
And you could tell from the collar that he was a young and lovely person,
Yeah.
a young, it was a soldier, whatever, Red Cross man.
Mm-hmm.
But I floated about. I carried 4 lifebelts floating around. Because I don't swim, you see. I've never learned to swim. And so...
you swallowed a lot of water.
Oh, talk about... For years afterwards, I could feel that cork.
Yeah.
Your mouth full of cork, and, if you're wretched, you brought up cork. And...
this was the cork insulation from the ship.
Yes, from the ship. And you see the oil, too.
Yeah.
But presently... I heard a noise, and a young man who was partly submerged called out, and he must have seen it. I didn't see it. Saw the one of our launches come towards him, and he called out, "There's a woman in the water." And then I looked over to see him, and poor thing, our on board medical, not the ship's company, but the head. Mm-hmm. He was a man who was very much disliked, the head of this officer, and he was standing up in the boat, and this young fella called out, and he asked to be picked up. He said, "Wait your turn." And I think I hated that man from that moment. I mean to say, fancy anybody. And he said, "I've lost my arm, sir." Well, he said, "Wait your turn." And he was standing up in his regimentals and quite all right. If I had a gun, I would have shot him. Yeah. Terrible. And this poor chap went down.
He didn't survive?
No, he went down because he'd lost one arm.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's very difficult to try and swim with one arm, especially if you've not...
Shock and loss of blood as well.
Yes, terrible.
Despite one incident and witnessing the ordeal of Lifeboat 4, Lifeboat 2 would become the second boat to be sucked into the Britannic's propellers. In this lifeboat, there was able seaman Archie Jewell.
And he saw this happen. He saw this boat get chopped up. They let go of the boat, his boat, and his was next. And he did recollect, he wrote a letter to his sister. He didn't think he'd make it. It was cutting the poor fellows to pieces. What made it so bad, the blades was half out of the water, so they were coming right down on the boat. Most of us jumped in the water, but it was no good. We was pulled right in under the blades. I shut my eyes and said goodbye to this world, but I was struck with a big piece of the boat and got pushed right under the blades, and I was going round like a top. I came up under some of the wreckage. Everything was going black to me, when someone on top was struggling and pushed the wreckage away, so I came up just in time. I was nearly done for. There was one poor fellow drowning, and he caught hold of me, but I had to shake him off, so the poor fellow went under. It did affect him.
After Archie was rescued, another lifeboat had been caught in the ship's wake, and it was believed to have been Lifeboat 17. In Lifeboat 17, Nurse Ada Garland would recall the moment where she almost made contact with the propellers.
Having climbed into our lifeboat, we were lowered away only to discover halfway down the plug wasn't in the bottom of the boat. There, we were suspended in mid-air whilst that important item was found. Down we were lowered again. It took some time before we managed to get away from the tremendous structure of the boat.
The occupants in Lifeboat 17 took oars and rowed away from the Britannic while the captain gave the order to stop engines in order to lower the lifeboats, or what the remaining lifeboats that were left behind. The captain wasn't become aware of these incidents for Lifeboats 4 and 2 until after the sinking. When he gave the order to stop the Britannic, Captain Bartlett would later record in a letter to the Director of Transport's Admiralty that the ship seems to stop settling a little, and I passed word to stop lowering boats and again attempted to work ship toward land. But she again started to settle rapidly and water began reported on D-deck. I gave the order for all to leave the ship, passing the word to the engine room and blowing the whistle for the last alarm. When the propellers had stopped, George Perriman hung on until he jumped into a lifeboat below him, though it's not known which lifeboat it was. George managed to escape with a few rope burns to his hand throughout the ordeal on the davit line. He saw the sea covered in red blood and blood on the Britannic's white flanks. Sheila described what happened next in her interview. She witnessed crews struggling to launch some of the lifeboats.
We got up on the boat deck and the ship was listing. The captain had wanted to save the ship by getting round the island of Kea from the rocky side, where there were cliffs, to a beach where he might land the ship, you see. And so I got in a lifeboat, and we were hanging over the side, and the Britannic was so big, they had to shout from the top with megaphones. And they said, are the little water trap doors shut? There were little bits in the bottom of the boat so that when it rained, the water drained away, and they were on deck or something like that. Anyway, by the time we got them shut, there was about a foot of water in the boat. We had been delayed anyway, because I think it was about 37, I don't know whether they were Lascars or anyway, something to do with the ship's crew, had gone off in a lifeboat. And we were all kept back because these men were told that they had to bring their boat back again. It held over 80 people. And anyway, we landed, but the minute you touched the water, the Britannic went and left you, because the propellers were coming up at the back, and they were turning round. The captain was trying to beat her, and she went away, and all you had to do was to get away from the Britannic, whatever happens. And the boats on either side of me were cut into ribbons by our own propellers. There were only 2 men killed with the torpedoing of the ship. The rest were caused by these propellers. Well, all the rowing I'd ever done was on Lake Windermere after Perch, and I was standing in about a foot of water, and as far as I remember, it was a stoker who didn't know how to row, but he helped me with the oar I was on, and we did get away. And Majesty was very good. She lived at Poole in the summer. Her father was head of Kodak, lived in Dulwich in the winter. And she got up and got hold of the rudder in the lifeboat she was in, and really knew how to lead the ship away. And the matron being in her ship, Matteson was very lucky because she was given the Royal Red Cross for saving matron.
By the time Sheila left the Britannic, the crew had noticed that the starboard list was now huge, and they were struggling to launch the rest of the lifeboats. Around that time, steam from boiler room number 4 had been released through the second funnel, and one of the port gantry davits became jammed. By 8:45 a.m., the forecastle was beginning to flood, and all attempts to save the Britannic had been dashed. The list was so great that she had turned a full 180 degrees from point of the explosion and sinking rapidly with her propellers out of the water, and she was done for.
He noticed that the ship was starting to settle a bit quickly, and he said, well, let's abandon the ship. So he gave some whistles that, gave the order to abandon the ship. A lot of the lifeboats were launched. And then, by this point, the Britannic was very down by the head, to the point that it was almost come to the forecastle deck, the forecastle, which is the foremost part of the vessel. Now, when this happens, usually a ship hasn't got long left on, but he seemed to he got some reports flooding had seemed to have slowed as the ship was sat stationary, which goes back to where I said that maybe him moving the ship may have actually escalated the sinking. So he stopped the order to abandon ship because sinking had slowed. So he moved the ship again for a final attempt at trying to reach Kea. But by this point, the ship is so top heavy with water. The bows are so far down, so low in the water that she isn't going to make it to Kea. The best he could do is probably shallow it. He must have had tunnel vision because he had thing. Don't forget, as a captain, you have all these lives in your hands, and the whole point is to try and save lives and try and save as many as you can. He noticed the ship started to sink rapidly again, but for some reason or another, the rudder seemed to respond again. Somehow it seemed to respond. So he noticed that the water was now D-deck. So now it's in real danger of sinking now. It's done for. But it's amazing as well that the Britannic it overshot Kea. You've got to remember that steering your ship without the rudder and just the engines, you've got less than 20-25% of your steering of your vessel. Then it's flooding as well. It's got all this weight in the bows. That's causing problems too. It's top heavy, so it's like having 4 flat, wheels, tires on your car. All absolutely awful. But then, for some reason, like I said, towards the end of the sinking, the rudder seemed to sort of respond a little bit and started to go to port, and that's still where it stands. It still sits to this day. It's sort of there on the wreck, and but he noticed the water was on D-deck.
Once the last lifeboat was launched and the water was creeping up to the bridge and at the feet of Assistant Commander Harry William Dyke, Captain Bartlett decided to abandon the ship.
I told him to go, and shortly after followed myself, walking into the water by the forward host gantry on the starboard side, the third funnel falling a few minutes later. Whilst in the water, I saw the ship sink, having listed well to starboard, and when finally disappearing, her stern was almost perpendicular, the time being given by those in the boats as 9:07 a.m.
Ada Garland said that the ship looked like a pitiable dying animal, and Violet Jessup said the ship rolled over bow first, and she said with a great roar, the ship just slid into the water, and it must have been an absolutely dreadful sight, and it sort of crumbled and bent itself. All the strain and structural damage that was done to the bow. The stern was still on the surface at that point, but to get this stern down, it kind of had this sort of fractures, so much strain and structural damage, it sort of opened the bow up and sort of detached. And the stern came down, some smoke and steam and everything just going up from the ship.
The HMHS Britannic sank in 55 minutes after being hit, and it only took a few seconds for it to reach sea floor.
And at 9:07, the ship sank. And Bartlett was picked up by the motor. He took immediate command of the launch and ordered the crew to sail to Port St. Nicolo and to dock there. And then he was told that some boats had found at the propeller, and that lives were lost. And he said that Colonel Anderson, who was in that boat, Colonel Anderson pulled him into the boat, into the motor. And Violet Jessup was in that boat. He said that she kind of made a little joke. She kind of made it a little bit funny that she thought it was a little bit funny that Amanda was dressed in pajamas.
Out of the 1,066 people on board, only 30 were lost. However, the ordeal wasn't over for the Britannic's surviving crew, nurses, and doctors, as it took a while before help could arrive. It would have been an amount of time, but after waiting for a maximum period of 3 hours, survivors would witness 3 trails of black smoke in the distance, which turns out to be the 3 rescue ships. They were the British Beagle-class destroyers, the HMS Foxhound, the HMS Scourge, and the HMS Heroic. But the ships had separated survivors, with one group boarding the Scourge, including Nurse Sheila Macbeth.
When there were no more explosions, it was safe. Lifeboats like mine went out over the wreck and picked people out of the water who were floating from lifeboats that's been cut, you see. And we had to tear up our petticoats and get bits of wood that were floating in the water, splints, and but tie them up as best we could. Well, 3.5 hours later, we saw smoke, and this was 2 British and 1 French destroyer coming to help us. And the French one took most of the orderlies and the men folk like that. And the nurses went in the others, and we were taken to the Parias, to the British Admiral ship, the Duncan. And I remember sitting on this destroyer at the back, and we had behind us all the empty lifeboats that people had been saved in, and they all broke away except 2. Number 13 and number 15. And as my lucky number had always been 13, in Woden we had 13 as a telephone, and were complimented by the post office for taking it. And when I went on the Britannic, I found that my cabin was number 15, and Majesty was number 13 in it, was me, and I was 15, something like that. I know that it was all, ever since when I take a ticket in a raffle, I give the name numbers 15 and 13, but I never win anything.
However, Nurse Ada Garland didn't mention which ship she boarded, but she would describe the certain conditions that she couldn't tolerate.
We were ushered into a tiny cabin. Imagine a cabin for 6, and we were scores crowded in that little room with the wounded men on little tables shrieking in pain. The heat and smell was such that I can remember being pulled out from being crouched up under the table, and a glass of brandy forced down my throat, and at last being able to breathe good, clean air. I was soon relieved.
We were in the crowd waiting before these destroyers came, and some notices were floating in the water saying patients only, nurses only. These the matron used to put across the deck at night on ropes to stop us all mixing. she didn't approve of the nurse and doctor having a flirtation up on the boat deck, and she tried to separate all the different classes of people. And when one of these notices floated by, when we were in these lifeboats, all feeling, I don't know what we were feeling, we'd just seen our wonderful ship go down, and one man who saw this notice saw it and said, "I'm surprised the old dame didn't put a notice to say doctors and nurses shouldn't drown on the same side of the ship." And I didn't dare to laugh because the matron was too close to me. But it was really very amusing.
After the Titanic, I used to, moan that on the Carpathia that picked us up, I couldn't buy a toothbrush.
Right.
And I couldn't live without cleaning my teeth, you see.
Yeah.
And the boys got a little bit, what brothers are.
Yeah.
Now, boy, the next time you go on a boat, for God's sake, if it's going to sink, put your toothbrush in your pocket. Well, no, don't laugh, John. When I went to my cabin after getting this, I was shown a room, no food now, nothing to drink, not even a cup of hot water. And I was full of seawater and powdered cork, which they love to put in ships.
Yeah.
And I got up and I thought, well, I must get some of this cork from around my teeth. And I was standing cleaning my teeth. Still very empty, you see. I hadn't had anything before, because in those days, I told you, communion, you couldn't have.
Yeah.
And there was a knock at the door, and the sister matron opened it. She didn't say, "Oh, Miss Jessup, I'm so glad to see you're alive. Have you had anything?" She said, "Where did you get that?" Well, I was afraid of being sick, because I still felt...
Yeah, ill.
Yes, you see, there was still salt water. And I took a breath, and I said, I brought it with me, quietly, for fear of...
Yeah.
And, shut the door with the bang went off. She never asked me. And matron never sent for me, never came near me. She was an old woman. She was much too old to be there.
Nevertheless, the destroyer took the nurses, doctors, and crew to the Bay of Piraeus, where they would receive blankets, coats, and a selection of tea, biscuits, oranges, and ham sandwiches. When they were getting ready to go home, the survivors were met by the Prime Minister of Valeda and transferred on board the HMS Valdivia, where they all reached home to Southampton on Boxing Day. Despite the trauma everyone involved faced, the British Admiralty were pondering for answers.
There was no formal inquiry into the sinking. There's an Admiralty report into the sinking. Captain Bartlett made a few sort of testimonies. He wrote letters. One in particular was on the Royal George, HMT Royal George, or HMS Royal George, and that was on the 30th of November 19. There's the odd report around that Captain Bartlett had made, or there was there wasn't like anything like the Titanic. I think there was supposed to be an inquiry into the sinking, but because of the war effort, there wasn't this huge impact, and Britannic sort of faded into history.
While there was an Admiralty report published from the crew of the HMS Duncan by an unknown publicist and a letter from Captain Bartlett to the Director of Transport's Admiralty, no formal inquiry was held during the ongoing events of the First World War. The Admiral report was immediately rushed, as the unknown publicist mentioned. It must be premised that the inquiry was necessary incomplete owing to the shortness of time at our disposal and the difficulty of finding witnesses scattered over the whole fleet. However, there is strong evidence to support that the mine explosion and the damage the Britannic had during her sinking. In the Admiral report, it was concluded that the explosion on the starboard side had impacted the forward of the bridge, which situated the forepeak and 1, 2, and 3 holds. The watertight bulkheads, numbers 5 and 6 boiler rooms, and the tunnel of the firemen's quarters were damaged, which led to the water beginning to fill number 2 and 3 holds before spreading into number 6, creating a list about 25 degrees starboard from then up until the final plunge. but the Admiralty couldn't agree on whether the Britannic was struck by a mine or a torpedo, as some people said they could see a periscope from a German submarine. The conclusion wouldn't be finalized, though, that they thought that the ship had struck a mine. The true answer wouldn't be revealed until the ship's discovery. The watertight doors were not closed, and it is believed that Captain Charles Bartlett ordered them to be closed. The implosion damaged the watertight doors to the fireman's tunnel and the doors between boiler rooms 5 and 6, with water flowing further aft into number 5. The Britannica survived longer, like her sister, the Titanic. However, the nurses had left their porthole windows open along the lower decks, sealing the fate of the younger Olympic-class liner. Nurse Ada Garland wrote in her memoir that the watertight doors of the Britannic weren't closed before and after the explosion, and the impact struck the machinery. She also mentioned that one of the first vessels to receive the Britannic's SOS call was one of our torpedo destroyers. This meant that U-73 could have been the first to hear the call, but the Germans cut off most of the message, but they're only listening parts of it. Ada didn't recall any further information, but the HMS Scourge, HMS Foxhound, and HMS Heroic likely received the SOS call and came to the rescue. However, it's unclear where she got this information from, an able seaman, a trimmer, or a crew member. Judging by the accounts, of course, this proves the amount of damage U-73 has caused, but whether these lessons were learned to make hospital ships safer is a mystery. After the sinking of the Britannic, many of the people who were on board went on to lead tragic and fascinating lives and careers. Able seaman Archie Jewell left the White Star Line to join the Midland Railway liner the SS Donegal, which was converted into a hospital ship named the HMHS Donegal. Unfortunately, Archie died in the sinking of the HMHS Donegal following an impact with a German submarine named UC-21 on the 17th of April 1917. He was 28 years old. Nurse Ada Garland stayed in the city of Athens for a brief period, but we don't know what happened to her after the Britannic. She died on the 24th of April 1959 in her hometown of Devon. Nurse Violet Jessup continued her career as a stewardess until her retirement in 1950. In 1970, she recorded her interview of the sinking with her friend John Maxstone Grantham for his book The Only Way to Cross.
You brought it with you because you hadn't had one on the Titanic,
Yes,
and you couldn't buy one on the Carpathia.
And my brothers
always ragged you about.
they ragged me. For goodness sake, next time, the first thing you put in your pocket is your toothbrush.
Well, on that amusing anecdote, we'll end the interview and have some lunch. Thank you very much.
She died 1 year later due to heart failure at the age of 83 on the 5th of May 1971. Captain Charles Bartlett went on to serve King George V of Britain after the conclusion of the First World War. His position was the Royal Naval Reserve aide-de-camp, and he served the king in that position until 1931. Bartlett was awarded a CPE by King George V, which wasn't normally awarded to a captain who had lost his ship. Bartlett passed away in a nursing home on the 15th of February 1945 at the age of 76. But what about George Pearman? After the traumatic experience of the sinking, George suffered from PTSD and his family believed it impeded his growth. However, he and his fellow scoutmates were honored with an engraved pocket compass and a certificate, and received a personal letter from the founder, Robert Baden-Powell, who congratulated the Southampton Scouts for their splendid behavior. George went on to work in various jobs on the sea and canals, allowing him to travel the world. After 7 years at sea, he joined the Church of England as a priest and later became a vicar. George passed away before reaching 100 years old on May 24th of 2000, and at the time of his death, he was the last survivor of the sinking of the HMHS Britannic. After the First World War, an auction was held on July 4th of 1919 to sell fittings from the Britannic. It is unknown what happened to most of the fittings, but some have been found in the United Kingdom. For instance, an interior lounge door is located at the Morris & Co. offices in Shrewsbury. Dining reception rooms interiors are at a pub in Belfast, and the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum owns a panel from the Britannic's first-class lounge. The most significant sale of the ship's interior took place in the early 1990s when an auction house in northern England auctioned the ship's bookcase from the second-class library. However, before the sale took place, the bookcase was withdrawn as a private party had bought it. It was later revealed that the purchaser was the late Queen Elizabeth II. The bookshelf hasn't been seen since, and is now in ownership of the Crown. The Britannic self-playing wild organ is in a museum in Switzerland. The wreck of the Britannic had been lying in 400 feet of water, lying on her side for 59 years before she was discovered by French explorer Jacques Cousteau and his team on board the research ship vessel the Calypso on the 3rd of December 1975. Since then, she had been visited by many historians and divers who also dived to the wreck of her older sister ship, the RMS Titanic, and Nurse Sheila Macbeth, who saw the wreck underwater in a submarine, though she was more interested in the wildlife than the wreck herself. Today, the HMHS Britannic is lying as an artificial reef and is visited by many divers, including her current owner, Simon Mills. Although she is a British hospital ship, she is under the strict protection of the Greek government, and this means that to visit the wreck, you need permission and a license to do so. If anyone fails to do that, and you bring in any artifacts from the wreck, they would face the prison sentence of 15 years, and trust us over the History Inside Nutshell team. Don't go there unless you either have permission and experience in diving. Lying at the bottom of the Aegean Sea, the Britannic and her wood interiors, the engines and the engine room, and the Turkish room are in excellent condition due to the warm temperature of the Kea Channel. It's because of this that she is more likely to outlive the Titanic before nature can claim her back. Although she usually overlooked of the 3 Olympic-class liners, the HMHS Britannic is remembered for her duty to her country as well as the life she could have had if the First World War hadn't broken out. During the war, she would go to hell and back until she sank by a German mine.